Welcome back to Star Trek Revisited, where I take a look each episode at an original series episode of Star Trek from a retrospective perspective. In today's episode, I'm going to be looking at the Season 1 episode, Tomorrow is Yesterday. And without any further ado, let's just get straight in. We start this episode in unfamiliar surroundings with a fighter jet, very of the time of filming of Star Trek the original series, the late 60s, is about to take off from an Air Force base. We cut to inside the Air Force base, and an Air Force officer is looking very confused on a screen, and his superior asks him, "What is it, Webb?" And the officer replies, "A blip, sir, just came on the screen, an aircraft of some sort, and it's not one of ours." The more senior officer asks him what was the approach, and the officer responds, "None, sir, it was just there like it fell out of the sky." The senior officer asks for its current position and gets the reply, "Directly over the Omaha installation, sir." And he picks up the telephone and calls Air Defense, who are going to want somebody up there to take a closer look. And he thinks that they might well have a real UFO on their hands. Now, an alarm blares, and we see them mobilizing this aircraft to take off, and we get some nice shots, actually, probably some stock footage, I would think, of this aeroplane taking off and going up into the skies. And then we get a familiar piece of music playing, and we see a very familiar sight in a very unfamiliar setting. We see the Enterprise, and it is in the skies of planet Earth in what appears to be the 1960s. So what the heck is going on, as our teaser comes to a close? The opening title is complete, and the title of this episode is Tomorrow is Yesterday, and we get a gorgeous shot of the Enterprise, not very high up in the skies of planet Earth, but it looks absolutely tremendous, as you can see the terrain below the cloud cover. And we get a captain's log by Kirk explaining just exactly what has transpired today. And he relays that the Enterprise was en route to Starbase 9 for resupply when a black star of high gravitational attraction began to drag us toward it. It required all warp power in reverse to pull us away from the star, but like snapping a rubber band, the breakaway sent us plunging through space out of control to stop here wherever we are. Kirk gets everyone to his feet, as everyone has been very shaken up by this experience, and he goes over to Spock, who relays that everything except for secondary systems is out, sir. We are on impulse power only. Kirk inquires auxiliaries, and Spock says if Mr. Scott is still with us, the auxiliaries should be coming on momentarily, as he goes to help Lieutenant Uhura get to her feet and back to her station. The lights come on, and Spock remarks if Mr. Scott is still with us, and he appears that he is. Damage control parties on all decks are to check in. All departments tie in with the record computer, report casualties and operational readiness to the first officer, relays Kirk over the intercom to the whole ship. And he says Kirk out as he's standing next to our old friend Mr. Leslie there at the engineering station. He then asks Lieutenant Uhura to contact Starfleet Control. He wants them alerted to the position of that black star that's in the area of Starbase 9. He then goes over to Spock, who relays that casualty reports indicate only minor injuries. Engineering reports, warp engines are non-operational. Mr. Scott overrode the automatic helm settings and is holding us in orbit on impulse power. Kirk asks, "In orbit where, Mr. Spock?" "Earth, Captain," replies Spock. "We were on a general heading in this direction when we were pulled in by the star. Apparently the breakaway threw us on in the same direction." We then see the view screen, and we see a lovely shot of close-up terrain of the Earth below the Enterprise, just beneath the cloud cover. We are too low in the atmosphere to retain this orbit, Captain. Engineering reports we have sufficient power to achieve escape velocity. And Kirk says to Mr. Sulu, "Give us some altitude, please." Sulu says, "Helm answering, but she's sluggish, sir." Uhura then relays that normal Starfleet channel has nothing on it but static. "I'm getting something on another frequency though, but it's not Starfleet." Kirk asks for it to be put on audio. And then they hear the voice of a man saying, "This is the 5:30 news summary. Cape Kennedy, the first manned moonshot is scheduled for Wednesday 6 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. All 3 astronauts who are to make this historic," and then the broadcast is cut off, and Kirk goes over to Spock and says, "Man, moonshot, that was in the late 1960s. And Spock replies, "Apparently, Captain, so are we? And Kirk says, what? And Spock says, the whiplash propelled us into a time warp, Captain, backward. Exact chronometer readings in a few moments. Uhura then relays, I'm getting ground-to-air transmission. Spock then says, scanners report some type of craft approaching from below us under cloud cover and closing. And then we see a beautiful shot of this US Air Force aircraft, which is approaching the Enterprise's position fast. And inside we see the pilot, whose name we will come to learn is Captain John Christopher. And he is looking around him, trying to see what they are dealing with here. And then there's a man on his radio hailing him, saying Blue J4, which is his call sign. This is Blackjack. We're tracking both you and the UFO. And Captain Christopher says, I have it on my screen, following. And we cut back to the Enterprise where they are hearing this transition. And Kirk says, Mr. Sulu, can you gain altitude faster? I want to outdistance him. Picking up Sir, says Sulu. She's just slow in responding. And the Enterprise sort of wobbles and shakes as it tries to climb. And back in Blue J4, Christopher relays that the UFO is picking up speed and climbing, so he's going in closer, and he tries to do so. Then the man on the radio says, you should be close enough for visual contact now, Blue J4. And indeed, yes, he is. And through his view screen on his jet, through his windscreen, whatever you want to call it, he can see the Enterprise, but obviously he doesn't know what that is. And he says, well, I can see it now. Whatever this thing is, it's big. 2 cylindrical projections on top, 1 below, and he's referring to the nacelles and the secondary hull. I don't know why he's not mentioning the saucer section specifically, but he goes on to say purpose undetermined, and he gets a message from his base. We have 2 flights scrambled and on the way. And Christopher relays that the UFO is climbing away fast. It won't be here. And he gives chase, and we get a gorgeous shot of the Enterprise climbing ever faster now and trying to move away from the aircraft in pursuit. And on the bridge, they are hearing the communications between the aircraft and the surface. Blue J4, you were ordered to close on the UFO and attempt to force him to land. Blue J4 acknowledges, and he says closing on target. Spock relays to Kirk that the aircraft is an interceptor equipped with missiles and possibly armed with nuclear warheads. If he hits us with one, he might damage us severely, perhaps beyond our capacity to repair under current circumstances. Kirk calls down to Scotty in the engine room and asks him to activate the tractor beam. Log onto that aircraft and hold it out there. Spock says, Captain, this aircraft might be too fragile to take our tractor beam, but it's too late. Kirk's already given this order to Scotty, who relays, tractor beam on, sir, we have the target. Now, this is my first thumbs down of this episode, and that Kirk really should know better here than to just seize this thing with a tractor beam. There surely are other options open to him here, other things that he can consider, but he goes for the tractor beam. I guess he doesn't have much time to react, but Spock is very, very keen to advise against this, but it's too late. Kirk has not consulted with him, and he's ordered Scotty to do so. And indeed, the tractor beam does seem to have an immediate effect on the aircraft, and Spock relays that the aircraft is breaking up, Captain. Kirk calls down to the transporter room, and there's a voice that responds. And this is the first time we hear the voice of Transporter Chief Kyle, who is played by John Winston. And he goes on to play the same character in many episodes of the original series, and also Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. And we will see him shortly in the episode. But anyway, Kirk calls down and he asks Kyle, can you lock on to the cockpit on that aircraft? And Kyle responds, scanning area, sir. And Kirk says, try and beam that pilot aboard. And Kirk goes down to the transport room to greet their incoming guest, who is materializing as he arrives backwards. So he's facing the interior of the transporter chamber. Kirk comes up behind him and says, welcome aboard the Enterprise. And he turns around and looks very confused, obviously, because this is a guy from the late 1960s who a second ago was in his fighter jet, pursuing a flying object, an unidentified flying object, or unidentified aerial phenomenon, as I believe we should call it these days. And one thing that I realized when watching this episode, actually, is Captain Christopher was sat down in his aircraft a few moments ago, but now he's on the platform and he's standing up. Can the transporter do that? I've never really thought of that before. Never occurred to me. Can it dematerialize you sitting down and rematerialize you standing up? Interesting. But he hears Kirk, he turns around and he looks at him and he says, you speak English? And Kirk smiles warmly and says, that's right. You can step off the transporter, sort of prompting him to introduce himself. Which he does. He says, Captain John Christopher, United States Air Force, serial number 4857932, in true Air Force military tradition, giving his name, rank, and serial number. Kirk encourages him to relax, Captain, you're among friends. And he introduces himself, I'm Captain James T. Kirk. And Christopher, quite understandably, he says, what's going on here? As he steps down, you people, who are you? All in good time, Captain. Meanwhile, let me apologize for bringing you aboard this ship so abruptly, but it couldn't be helped. I didn't know that your craft couldn't stand up to our tractor beam. And Kirk's starting to share loads of stuff with him here, and he should know better. He's saying our ship, he's given him his name, our tractor beam. Oh, he should know better. But anyway, Christopher's not buying any of this. Don't give me any double talk. Just tell me who you are. And then Kirk sort of clamps down a bit and establishes his authority and his control over the situation and says, we'll tell you what we decide to tell you in a few moments. In the meantime, relax, you're our guest. I have a feeling you'll find it interesting. The intercom buzzes and Kirk goes over and answers it. Kirk here, what is it, Mr. Spock? The aircraft has completely broken up, relays Spock. Shall we turn off the tractor beam? Oh my gosh, what a thing for Spock to call down and say the tractor beam is still engaged and it's targeted on nothing. Why would he not just turn it off? Why would a Vulcan science officer, first officer, experienced, why would he call down and ask Kirk if they could turn off the tractor beam? What a ridiculous call. So that is a major thumbs down for me. Kirk says affirmative, you silly man, and he relays, well, he doesn't say you silly man, but that's what I'm thinking. We have the pilot aboard. I'll be right up. Kirk out. And he instructs Christopher to follow me. And they start walking through the corridors, and a young female crewman comes past and says, good morning, Captain. And Christopher gives her a good looking at and seems surprised. I mean, why wouldn't anything he's encountering surprise him? But he looks over to Kirk and says, oh, woman? And Kirk just says, a crewman. And they get in the turbolift and off they go up towards the bridge. And Christopher says to Kirk, must have taken quite a lot to build a ship like this. And Kirk acknowledges there are only 12 like it in the fleet. And this is the first time we get that acknowledgement in the original series of how many Constitution-class starships there are. And we see quite a few of them in this series in seasons 1, 2, and 3. And then Christopher says, did the Navy? And Kirk cuts him off saying, we're a combined service, Captain. Our authority is the United Earth Space Probe Agency, USPAR. And this is the last time that is ever mentioned in Star Trek. And Christopher rightly questions United Earth? And Kirk says, well, this is very difficult to explain. We're from your future. A time warp placed us here. It was an accident. And Christopher rightly notices that you seem to have a lot of them. But I can't deny the fact that you are here with this ship, but I never have believed in little green men as the turbolift doors enter to the bridge. And Spock hears and sees this and says, neither have I. And naturally, never having seen an extraterrestrial before, Christopher looks at Spock in quite some bewilderment. And Kirk introduces him. He says, Captain Christopher, this is my first officer, Lieutenant Commander Spock. And I believe this might be the last time that Spock is referred to as Lieutenant Commander in this series, despite the fact that all through season 1 he has had what would become to known as the two solid stripes on his cuffs, which signify the rank of a full commander, rather than the one solid stripe and one broken stripe. Kirk says to Christopher, feel free to look around, Captain. Don't touch anything, but I think you'll find it interesting. Again, feel free to look around. Come on, what are you doing, Kirk? Temporal Prime Directive and all that, but whatever. Christopher says, interesting is a word and a half for it, Captain. And off he goes and has a look. And Spock and Kirk start chatting, and Spock says, we've achieved a stable orbit out of Earth's atmosphere. Our deflectors are operative, enough to prevent our being picked up again as a UFO. And Mr. Scott wishes to speak with you about the engines. And Kirk says, very well, Mr. Spock. Anything else on your mind? And Spock immediately says, we cannot return him to Earth, Captain. He already knows too much about us and is learning more. And wouldn't you have thought Kirk would have realized this? But Spock goes on and says, I do not specifically refer to Captain Christopher, but suppose an unscrupulous man were to gain certain knowledge of man's future. Such a man could manipulate key industries, stocks, and even nations, change what must be. And if it is change, Captain, then you and I, all that we know now, might not even exist. And Kirk says, your logic can be most annoying, Mr. Spock. And Kirk turns around and says to Captain Christopher, who is being shown all sorts of stuff by Lieutenant Uhura, he says, that flight suit must be uncomfortable. Why don't you have the quartermaster fix him up with something more suitable? And then I want to see you and him being Spock, in my quarters. And off he goes. And Christopher, again, is sort of touching his own ears as if to express bewilderment at the fact that Spock has pointed ears. So, an interesting scene. In the next scene, we are in Kirk's quarters, and he is switching on his personal computer and wanting to record a captain's log as Spock walks in with Captain Christopher, who is now dressed in a standard Enterprise Starfleet uniform with a lieutenant's stripe on the side, as Kirk starts recording his supplemental log to the effect of Engineering Officer Scott informs warp engines damaged but can be made operational and re-energized. And then the computer, in the voice of Majel Barrett, responds, "Computed and recorded, dear." And Kirk looks annoyed, irritated, and says, "Computer, you will not address me in that manner. Compute." And the computer says, "Computed, dear." Kirk looks annoyed and says, "Mr. Spock, I ordered this computer and its interlinking systems repaired." Spock looks a tad irritated and says, "I have investigated it, Captain. To correct the fault will require an overhaul of the entire computer system and a minimum of 3 weeks at a starbase." And Kirk says, I wouldn't mind so much if it only didn't get so affectionate. Spock says it also has an unfortunate tendency to giggle. Christopher asks, "I take it that a lady computer is not routine." Spock says, "We put into Signet 14 for general repair and maintenance. Signet 14 is a planet dominated by women. They seem to feel that the ship's computer system lacked a personality. They gave it one. Female, of course," he says, almost rolling his eyes in doing so. And Christopher laughs and says, "Well, you people certainly have interesting problems. I'd love to stay around to see how your girlfriend works out." But then Kirk interjects and says, "I'm afraid you'll have to. We can't send you back." And Christopher starts to look confused and concerned and says, "Can't? Well, Spock here told me your transporter can beam down an object even from an orbit this high." Kirk says, "It's not the transporter, it's you. You know what the future looks like. If anyone else finds out, they could change the course of it and destroy it." And Christopher, being very, very savvy here, says, "Well, then my disappearance would change something too, surely." And Spock shakes his head and says, "No, I've run a computer check on all historical tapes. They show no record of any relevant contribution by Captain John Christopher." And then Captain Christopher replies, "Look, Captain, I don't buy all of your time accident story. Now, the experts can figure out who you are, but it's my duty to report what I've seen. Well, what would you do?" And Kirk says, "I'd report if I could. We can't take the risk." And Christopher says, "Well, I don't want to know about risks. I have a wife, 2 children. And Kirk just says, "I'm sorry." Scotty comes on the intercom then and says, "Engine room to Captain Kirk." And Kirk acknowledges and says, "What is it, Scotty?" And Scotty says, "Well, everything's jerry-rigged, but we're coming along with the repairs. We should be able to re-energize after about 4 hours, but we've got no place to go in this time, if you see what I mean." And he raises an interesting problem. They can get the engines all back up to speed again, but where, or more importantly, when do they go? And Kirk acknowledges this and says, "Carry on, Mr. Scott." And Christopher astutely observes, "Well, maybe I can't go home, but neither can you. You're as much a prisoner in time as I am." And we get to another captain's log as Kirk restates this problem, that they are still locked in time and they have a passenger aboard whom we do not want and we cannot return. And the computer once again inappropriately addresses Kirk and says, "Recommendation for his disposition, dear." And at this point, I wonder what the motivation was to include this rather pointless subplot in this episode of this affectionate computer. It doesn't really add anything. I mean, it's quite amusing, but it doesn't add a single thing to the plot. Kirk jibes back here with a little bit of humour, saying, "My recording computer has a serious malfunction. Recommended either be corrected or scrapped. Compute." And the computer hesitantly responds, "Computed," in a very hurt voice, which I'll admit is quite amusing. Spock then calls on the intercom bridge to Captain Kirk. Kirk acknowledges and says, "I've got some new information regarding Captain Christopher. Important I see you both immediately." And Kirk acknowledges and says, "Yes, report to my quarters. I'll contact the captain." And he tries to reach Christopher on the intercom, but there is no response. Kirk immediately calls security and says Captain Christopher is not in his assigned quarters. He may be trying to escape the ship. I want a man outside the transporter room immediately. I'll head there myself. And we cut to a security officer casually strolling through the corridors with his phaser just on his belt, just waiting to be grabbed. And indeed, Christopher is hiding around the corner and he attacks him and renders him unconscious, steals the phaser and walks into the transporter room. And big thumbs up from me. This is the first visual appearance we see of John Winston as Transporter Chief Kyle, a great, fine English actor. I believe he's English or British. He certainly speaks in a British accent. We'll check that out when we get to the end in the IMDb section of the video. I'm pretty certain he was a British actor, though. And he pulls the phaser on Kyle and says, all right, nice and easy. Now I'm going to step into that thing, pointing to the transporter, and you're going to transport me back down to Earth. But Kirk comes in behind him and quickly and easily disarms him, and Christopher is laying flat on the floor. Next scene, we're in sick bay, and McCoy and Kirk are looking down at Christopher, who's on a bio bed. Kirk relays to Bones he tries to escape. I know how he feels, but I can't send him back with what he knows. And then McCoy quite rightly expresses the concern that, Jim, what if we can't go back? We certainly can't go back to Earth. And if we do get back to where we belong and we have to bring Christopher with us, then he won't belong either. And Kirk comments, we're roughly about the same age, he and I, which I'm taking to mean that they're probably about 33, because in season 1, Kirk will be about 33, because he says in season 2 that he's 34. And Kirk goes on, but in our society, he'd be useless. And McCoy says, well, maybe he could be retrained or re-educated. And Kirk says, well, could he be retrained to forget his family? And Christopher's come to now, and he quite appropriately says the answer to that is no. Kirk goes over to him and says, are you all right? And he responds, yes, I see physical training is required in your service too. Just as Spock is entering the sick bay, and he replies, crude methods, but effective. And Christopher says, what do you mean by that? And McCoy laughs and says, it was just a joke, Captain. Kirk asks Spock, you said you had some additional information, Mr. Spock. And then Spock goes on to say that I made an error in my computations. And McCoy is very, very keen on hearing this. He says, oh, this could be a historic occasion. And Spock goes on to say, I find that we must return Captain Christopher to Earth after all. And Christopher wonders, well, why? You said I made no relative contribution. Spock says, poor choice of words on my part. I neglected in my initial run-through to correlate the possible contributions by offspring, and in doing so, running this cross-check on that factor, I find that your son, Colonel Sean Jeffrey Christopher, headed or will head the first successful Earth-Saturn probe. And Christopher looks confused and says, wait a minute, I don't have a son. And McCoy smiles and says, you mean yet? And Spock goes on, unless we return Captain Christopher to Earth, there will be no Colonel Sean Jeffrey Christopher. And Kirk acknowledges the inevitableness of the situation, and he says, well, that's it, isn't it? We have to find some way of, and as he's trying to complete the sentence, Christopher is smiling at the realization that he's going to have a son, a boy. I'm going to have a son. And it's a nice little moment. We then see the Enterprise in an orbit over Earth, which looks very, very lovely in its remastered glory. And then we get a scene where Kirk and Spock are in the briefing room, and they are continuing to ponder this problem. And Spock is saying, acknowledging that we must return Captain Christopher, there are several problems, prime of which is the explanation of his return, which is a very good point. We track down his plane wreckage. It crashed in an open section of southern Nebraska as Spock paces around the table, and we see that Christopher is in this briefing room too. And that means that search parties will be crawling all over that wreckage, and Captain Christopher himself complicated the matter also. And he goes on to explain that when I made visual contact, I turned on my wing cameras, and I got up close enough to take some pretty clear pictures of you, and Air Defense Control was probably recording my radio transmissions. Kirk then says, if I remember my history, that these things were being dismissed as weather balloons, explainable things, at least publicly. And Spock says, Captain, our tractor beam caught and crushed an Air Force plane. It'll be impossible to explain this as anything other than a genuine UFO, possibly alien, definitely destructive. And then Kirk says, well, what about our other problem, Mr. Spock? Any ideas on how to get us back to our own time? Spock says, a theory, a reverse application of what happened to us. Logically, it could work. Also, logically, there are 100 variables, and he mentions variables later on in Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home, when they're calculating time travel again, and I always make that connection when he says that sentence. And he goes on to say, any which of those variables could put us in a worse position. Kirk says, we're going to have to go back and get those reports and photos. If the captain feels duty-bound to report what he saw after we've returned him, there won't be any evidence to back him up. Christopher says, well, that makes me out to be either a liar or a fool. And Spock says, well, not at all. You'll simply be one of the thousands who thought he saw a UFO. Christopher then tries to get on the landing party and says, I know that base. I was stationed there a year ago. I'd like to... And Kirk says, no, Captain, thank you. And Kirk goes on and says, if anything should go wrong, you might get hurt. We couldn't risk that. neither you or your son. And Christopher says, well, I'd like to help. I could at least sketch a layout of the place for you, show you where the record section and the photo lab are. And why would a pilot know that? That's interesting, but maybe he's just got an eye for detail. Maybe he's got a good memory. And Kirk gives him a pad and lets him begin his sketching. And we cut down to a scene of the exterior of the Air Force Base. In the corridors of the base, we see that this is the 498 Air Base Group Air Defense Command, and we see some nice trophies on the cabinets there as an Air Force soldier walks past on patrol, presumably, and in beam Captain Kirk and Mr. Sulu right into a middle of a corridor, which seems like a very, very silly place to beam into, because a couple of seconds earlier they would have bumped right into that guy. Why did they not pick a more discreet beam down point, shall we say? And also, something that bothers me in this scene, why are they wearing their uniforms? Why are they not at least coming in disguise so they can at least try and blend in if they are spotted? Ridiculous. They start wandering about, pretty much in plain sight again, and Kirk sort of gestures to Sulu his amusement at the papers on the notice board, and Sulu smiles back, and they go around, and they find themselves at the Statistical Services Division Airbase Group door. Kirk tries to open it, he can't. Sulu gives him a device which opens the door, and in they go into the darkness, and they start looking around, and they find a computer, a very, very old computer, which Kirk calls primitive, and Sulu says, you'll make the devil's own noise if you start it. And Kirk says, I'm not planning to start it. Meanwhile, up on the Enterprise, in the transporter room, McCoy is pacing, he's worried, and he asks Spock, who's standing behind the transporter console, how long have they been down there now? And Spock says 15 minutes and 28 seconds. And McCoy says, well, shouldn't they be coming up? And Spock rightly replies, it is a fact, Doctor, that prowling by stealth is more time-consuming than a direct approach. I wouldn't exactly call what they've been doing as stealth. They've basically been wandering around in plain sight. Spock's about to say something else when an annoyed McCoy says, shouldn't you be working on your time warp calculations, Mr. Spock? And Spock casually looks at him and says, I am. And this is a great little moment where McCoy looks bewildered at the realization that Spock has actually been standing there doing it in his head at the same time. Meanwhile, back on the base, Kirk and Sulu are going about their task when in walks behind them a Air Force Army sergeant, and with his revolver drawn at them. And there we go, hands up, one at a time, hand over those bags and belts, and they cooperate. And back on the Enterprise, McCoy's getting even more worried. It's been too long. Jim should have at least signaled by now. And Spock relents and says, you may be correct, Doctor, and he instructs Kyle to open a communicator channel. Communicator beeps back on the surface, and the sergeant says, what was that? And Kirk pleads dumb and says, well, what was what? I didn't hear anything, said Sulu. And then the sergeant has the communicator in his hand, and he says, it's that noise, it's coming from one of these things. And he opens it up, and the communicator starts whirring, and he's accidentally pressed the emergency signal, which Sulu comments on. And this makes the sergeant very jumpy. He says, stay right where you are, sort of reinforcing his control over his two captors by pointing the gun more firmly at them. Back on the Enterprise transport room, Kyle relays, one emergency signal, sir, to which Spock says, beam up immediately. And wouldn't you know it, the sergeant on the surface starts dematerializing. Kirk has a look on his face of, oh my God, what has just happened here? He can't believe it. And he and Sulu look at each other, Sulu hands on hips. It's always quite amusing to me seeing Shatner and George Takei acting together here, given the hostility that still, I believe, exists between them to this day. Well, certainly in one direction at least. I don't think Shatner really gives a damn, but George Takei certainly doesn't care for William Shatner, but it always amuses me. Anyway, the Enterprise, the sergeant, the poor sergeant, appears on the platform, and he quite rightly looks absolutely terrified and confused and bewildered, and Spock reacts with a surprised eyebrow, and he goes over to him, and the poor sergeant is just frozen. He cannot move. Kirk signals the Enterprise, and Spock acknowledges and asks, are you all right? And Kirk says, yes, I'm all right, but as you can see, we have another problem, and our situation has escalated. We now have another unwanted guest. Kirk relays to Spock that your surprise package is an air police sergeant from the base. I want you to keep him in the transporter room. No use in letting him see more of the ship than is necessary. Finally, some common sense from Kirk. We should have done that sort of thing with Christopher from the start. Spock says, I don't believe there'll be any trouble, Captain, in that respect. Our guest seems quite content to remain where he is, as McCoy goes over and casually disarms him, and the sergeant doesn't move a muscle. He's so freaked out by this. It's quite cool. Kirk ends the transmission, and they then go over to continue their work on the surface, and he asks Sulu, what was the chronometer reading when we first sighted Christopher's jet? Sulu says it was 5:30 in that time zone. Put it at the end of these tapes, will you, says Kirk. You got them all now. And then Kirk goes out to check something else with Sulu, and off they go to the photo lab room. And they say, right, we'll try the dark room next. And they do. They go in and they trigger an alarm in the photo section. Now, this is weird to me, because why didn't they trigger any alarms before? Why did it not happen in that first room they went into? But anyway, this is picked up immediately, and a very senior-looking officer comes out of his office, puts his hat on, and casually says, photo lab, and gets his two goons to follow him. Meanwhile, we're seeing Kirk examining the negatives, the film, and he's looking and squinting. Let's see, that's it. That's all of them. He says, signal Mr. Spock that we're almost ready to beam up. I'll make a check of the files just in case. And he goes out of the room and he sees those officers coming in to challenge him. And he does the right thing here. He closes the door behind him because there's no way he's not going to be seen. And he makes it obvious to Sulu that he's been seen, and he's basically signaling without words that Sulu should beam up to the ship and leave him. Kirk launches into these three unwanted people in his presence, and a little bit of a struggle ensues. Kirk gets the better of them initially as he catches them off guard and by surprise. Sulu, meanwhile, is hearing the commotion outside and is signaling the ship to beam him up. And some great little tussles going on here as Kirk swings on a door and plays leapfrog with another, and eventually he gets taken down, just 3 against 1. He was never going to win ultimately, and he's taken into custody. The senior officer goes into the photo lab and there's no one in there, and he comes out and says, well, all right, where's the other one? And Kirk says, well, what other one? And the officer says, your partner, I saw you looking that way. And he says, no, just me. Besides, can anyone get out of there without you seeing them? And the officer sort of realizes the logic of this, and Kirk gives him a little smirk, which is quite amusing. Back on the ship, Sulu is in the briefing room with Spock and McCoy, and Spock is immensely satisfied with Sulu's decision to beam up to the ship. It's quite a correct decision, Mr. Sulu. Then the engine room signals Mr. Spock and says, we've completed re-energizing the warp engines. We can initialize them at any moment. Spock says, do so now, engineer. And he ends the transmission and he looks at the film and he says, poor photography. McCoy gets really annoyed at this and says, blast your theories and observations, Mr. Spock. What about Jim? He's alone down there, probably under arrest, and he doesn't have a communicator, and we can't locate him or beam him back without one. Spock says, we are well aware of that, Doctor. And then he asks Captain Christopher to report to the briefing room. Back on Earth, Kirk is being interrogated by the senior officer, and he says, now look, mister, you and I had better start communicating. You got all the way inside here without tripping any alarm. Well, not true. He did. He tripped the alarm in the photo lab, so that's an error. He says, well, how did you do it? And Kirk says, believe me, Colonel, you wouldn't believe me. And this is true, to be fair. And this scene reminds me a lot of when Chekhov gets captured in Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home. It's very, very similar indeed. As the officer asks him, is that a uniform of some kind? And Kirk just says, well, this little old thing is just something I slipped on. And the conversation gets a little bit more aggressive at this point. And Kirk says, well, all right then, truth is I'm a little green man from Alpha Centauri, a beautiful place, you ought to see it. And the Air Force guy says, I am going to lock you up for 200 years. And Kirk, acknowledging the irony of that statement, says, that ought to be just about right. And that's interesting because I think that's probably the first even vague acknowledgement of the time period that the original series is set in. It's canon that it's set in the late 23rd century in the 2260s, but I think this is the first ever indication of that in the original series. Anyway, back on the Enterprise, Christopher is in the briefing room now, relaying that Kirk is probably being held in the security section. Spock says, can you give us the coordinates? And Christopher says, yes, but you're not going to get them unless you take me with you. And it goes back and forth, but Spock realizes that Christopher has the upper hand here. And he says, Mr. Sulu, you and Captain Christopher will beam down with me. Issue hand phasers, one for you, one for me. Set them on heavy stun force. And Captain Christopher finds this amusing that he's not getting a phaser. He says, you don't trust me, Spock. And Spock says, in fact, I do, but only to a certain point, which is fair. In the transport room, Sulu, Spock, and Christopher eventually get on the transporter pad as Spock adjusts Christopher to stand in the right position, and they beam on down. And our friend, the Air Police Sergeant, is just hanging around the transport room with Transporter Chief Kyle now, and he's just, at least he's off the pad now and he's moving, but he still looks in an utter state of shock. And he sees them beam down and he says to Kyle, they do that all the time? And Kyle just says, yeah. And he says, are you hungry? And he says, what would you like? Maybe some chicken soup. And Kyle instantly produces it from one of the food synthesizers, which confuses the poor old sergeant even more. This poor guy, as he takes a taste of this instantly ready chicken soup, which is right there in front of him. Down on the base, Spock, Sulu, and Christopher have materialized, and they're heading around a corner where there is a guard posted. Christopher walks right past them, bold as brass, and just says hi there, as a distraction, basically. And the guard rightly said, well, who's this guy? He says, just a minute, sir. Starts chasing after him. And then Sulu comes up right behind him and gives him the old karate chop, which I love seeing Sulu do that. It's amazing. In the room, Kirk is still sat down being interrogated. The senior officer is just shuffling some papers at this point. It looks like they're just waiting around at the moment, waiting for Kirk to be picked up by another branch or whatever. But they're basically waiting. There's a knock on the door, and the senior guy says, see what that is, man. The door opens, and Spock just looks uber cool here as the door opens. And there, standing right in front of this poor Air Force man, is this sight that he was not expecting, this pointed-eared person. And Spock just casually gives him the Vulcan neck pinch. The senior officer goes for his gun, but before he has a chance, Kirk clobbers him and renders him unconscious. And Spock says to Kirk, don't you find that painful, Captain? And Kirk says, yes, I do. What's he doing here? Gesturing to Christopher. And Spock relays why. He says he knew the exact beam down coordinates for this section of the base. Kirk then says, Mr. Sulu, did you have a chance to check out those tapes? And Sulu relays, Mr. Spock ran them through our computers. They were the right ones. As Spock mysteriously seems to casually walk into the office of the senior officer, whose name was actually Lieutenant Colonel Fellaini. Sulu continues, we got them all. We got all the tapes. And Kirk then says, as he's reattaching his phaser and all of his equipment to his belt, says, Sulu signaled transporter chief for the beam up. At that exact moment, Christopher has armed himself with a revolver. And he says, not me. And Kirk says, don't be a fool. And realizing that Spock's not there, he says, Spock, come out of there. Kirk says, you can't explain your presence on this base. And Christopher says, I told you my duty is to report everything I've seen. And to Christopher, that's all that matters. That's explanation enough. And at that moment, Spock circles around behind him and he gives him the Vulcan neck pinch. And I don't know if Spock has actually found a way around there from the Colonel's office, or whether he's actually beamed from, signal the Enterprise, say, beam me back outside again so I can sneak up behind him. But it's quite a cool moment, and he renders Captain Christopher unconscious and relays to Kirk, I suspected he might not want to return with us. And Kirk gives a little smirk and says, for a beam up, Mr. Sulu. We get a captain's log where Kirk relays that they must make an attempt to break free of this time, or we and our reluctant passengers will remain its prisoners. At this point, all we have is a theory, as again we're in the briefing room and we've got Kirk there, Scotty there, Spock, and Spock says Mr. Scott and I both agree that the only possible solution is the slingshot effect, like the one that put us here. My computations indicate that if we fly toward the sun, seek out its magnetic attraction, then pull away at full power, the whiplash will propel us into another time warp. Christopher says slingshots are fine for you people. How do you propose to return the sergeant and me? And this is where the science gets a bit hokey for me. Spock then says logically, as we move faster and faster toward the sun, we will begin to move backward in time. That bit's fine. We'll actually go back beyond yesterday, beyond the point where we first appeared in the sky. Then breaking free will shoot us forward in time and will transport you back at a point before any of this happened. So that's all well and good, but how they do it ultimately doesn't make sense. And we'll get to that when it happens. Or actually, we can touch on it now because Kirk immediately says, you won't have anything to remember because it never would have happened. But that to me is rubbish. That's complete rubbish because it will have happened. The act of transporting somebody down to Earth after they've had the slingshot effect around the sun and moved through time, it's not going to erase Christopher's memory or the sergeant's memory. They could return prior to the time they left, but I'm not buying that their memory would be erased because there's no indication that would happen because it never happens in any instance to anyone else. So why would that be the case? Christopher says, what if we can't pull free of the sun? And Scotty assures, oh, we'll do that all right, Captain. We'll not be getting so close that my engines couldn't pull us out. But what I am worried about, sir, is that we may not have much control when we're thrown forward again. And that's braking control. If I can't stop us soon enough, we may overshoot our time, and if I stop the engine suddenly, the strain may tear us apart. Any way we do it, it means a mighty rough ride. And Kirk acknowledges, well, gentlemen, we all have to take a chance, especially if one is all you have. Assume your stations. And then we get a lovely shot of the Enterprise leaving the orbit of planet Earth, and we get that lovely reverse view screen shot with the nacelles and Earth behind it looking absolutely beautiful. Christopher's having a lovely look at Earth here, and he's taking in the moment, and this is a nice moment which I really like. He's taking it all in as Kirk says, ahead, warp factor 3, Mr. Sulu. And Christopher says, I never thought I'd make it out into space. I was in line to be chosen for the space program, but I didn't qualify. And Kirk says, take a good look around, Captain. You made it here ahead of all of them. As the Enterprise moves closer to the sun, which looks absolutely brilliant, as the Enterprise closes in on it and begins to look obscured. The remastered effects here look absolutely wonderful, and I love them. Sulu says, our speed is increasing, we're travelling at more than warp 8. Kirk nods over to Mr. Spock, who says, since we've passed Mercury, the sun's pull on us has increased greatly. From here, we'll move even faster. And notice the chronometers, they've started backward, and indeed we can see that. The chronometers have started moving backward. What we can also see on this chronometer is that we don't have a star date, because there isn't a star date. Now, that's another bit of a red flag to me, because the ship itself doesn't know that they've moved in time, surely. So why would the star date be blank? Wouldn't it just think it's the star date that it thinks it should be in terms of how time has moved for them on a linear basis rather than a time travel basis? But anyway, Spock goes on to say, minute by minute, the speed of time passage will now increase. And Kirk says to Christopher, get your gear, report to the transporter room. And he jokes, and Captain, you only have about 15 years, so you better hurry. And Christopher smirks to him. And the Enterprise starts going around the sun, and the effect here is rather nice, and I really like it. And Spock says, we're approaching breakaway point on the countdown. And Kirk says, now, Mr. Sulu. And in they go into the slingshot effect, and they all wobble about a bit. And Kirk says, more power, Mr. Sulu. And Sulu says, it's maximum now, sir. And she's fighting it. And the Enterprise does get breakaway speed and pulls away from the sun. And Spock says, we've broken free and are heading back now. And Sulu says, we're gaining speed now, Captain. Now at warp 4. Chronometer moving forward again, Captain. Kirk calls down to the transporter room to Captain Christopher, who acknowledges. And Kirk says, we're coming up on Earth fast, Captain. Are you ready? Christopher acknowledges everything A-OK. Captain, thanks for the look ahead. Kirk says, our pleasure, Captain. Bridge out. See a lovely shot of Earth on the view screen as Spock says 20 minutes. But it'll be close. Kirk says, prepare to energize. And this is where the hokey science comes in. As we see, we've moved back to the time where Christopher initially intercepted the Enterprise in his jet. And that is happening again. So at this point in time, there are two Captain John Christophers. One in the jet, one in the Enterprise. And we see this version of Christopher in his jet, just about to intercept the Enterprise again. And what we see is the effect of one Christopher being beamed into the other Christopher. And this just... No. This just does not work. And the writers of this story just clearly didn't understand quantum physics, temporal mechanics, anything like that. They wrote this for story purposes, quite frankly. So I can kind of forgive them for that. But no, this is just terrible writing. And all of a sudden, two Christophers become one, and it's as if this never happened, and he's back at the moment where he was about to intercept the Enterprise, and he's... Wait, what? I could have sworn there was something there, some kind of ship, but nothing could have moved that fast. And as Kirk listens to the transmission on the radio, he's said, mark it down as another UFO, Blue J4 returning to base. Spock then says, approaching second beaming point, Captain. Kirk orders them to energize. And again, our poor hapless sergeant. And thank heavens this hokey science works for him, because I think he would have had a nervous breakdown if he had seen any more of the future. He didn't cope with it well at all, the poor fella. And he is beamed into himself at all. And he's patrolling the corridors again as if nothing happened. He looks into the room and there's nothing there. And that's the end of our two unwanted guests. Now we've just got to get the Enterprise home. And Sulu relays, past Pluto, sir. And Kirk says, what's our reading, Mr. Spock? Spock says, approaching our century, Captain. Braking should begin now. And Kirk orders full braking power. Scotty then says, pulling away from the sun weakened them, sir. They may blow apart if I reverse. Kirk says, no choice, Mr. Scott. Scotty says, aye, sir. And he goes over to his engineers. And it's nice to see Scotty in his engine room ordering his crew about. I think this is the first real example we've seen of this in season 1, where we've seen Scotty in his engine room before, but we're never really just in a normal, ordinary way. So it's quite nice. 50 years ago, says Spock, as they start buckling again and shaking all over the place. And Scotty indeed signals up to the bridge and says, engines are on full reverse and they're buckling. And we see the Enterprise in all her glory come out of it, and things start to settle, and Kirk says the line that they seem to like saying this episode, Mr. Scott is still with us. And Uhura says, Captain, and they're getting a signal, and it's Starfleet. They're back in their time, and we hear on the intercom, Starfleet control calling Enterprise. Frequency open, sir, says Uhura. And Kirk calls in, Starfleet control, this is the Enterprise, and then they get Starfleet control, repeating message. and Kirk relays the Enterprise is home. And that's it. That's our episode. And we're all done. It's directed by Michael O'Herlihy. When I checked, he only directed the one episode. It's worth noting that Star Trek royalty, Dorothy D.C. Fontana, wrote this episode, and I'll forgive her the time travel science, but it does bother me. But a legend like D.C. Fontana, I've got to give her a break. We get into the cast. We have Roger Perry as Major Christopher here. Now, he was called Captain Christopher in the show, so that's a bit weird. I don't quite understand that. We see DeForest Kelley as McCoy. Hal Lynch played the Air Police Sergeant. We had Richard Merrifield as the technician, John Winston as the transporter chief, and Ed Peck as Colonel Fellaini. We've also got Jimmy Doohan as Scotty, George Takei as Sulu, Nichelle Nichols as Uhura, Mark Dempsey as an Air Force captain, Jim Spencer as air policeman, and Sherry Townsend as the crew woman who walked past Christopher and Kirk at the start of the episode. The music was composed by Alexander Courage. Let's take a look at the full cast on IMDb as they look for this episode. There's Roger Perry, again credited as Major Christopher. We've got Hal Lynch, she doesn't warrant a picture. John Winston there as Kyle. And no other real surprises here that I can see. We've got Brent there. I didn't spot Brent or Billy Blackburn in this one. I'm not doing my job correctly, but I somehow missed them. Let's take a look at John Winston, born in 1927, died in 2019. And his major contribution to popular culture was his portrayal of Lieutenant Kyle in Star Trek, appearing in a total of 11 episodes, was either seen as a transporter chief or as part of bridge personnel, where he would mostly act as a helmsman, which is true. And he also appeared in Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, as Kyle again. But there we go. That's it. It doesn't tell me, as far as I can see, what his nationality is. But as I drill down into his profile a bit more, I can see that he was actually born in Leeds in Yorkshire, England, in the UK. Our final job here is to rate this episode. Now, on IMDb, this gets a 7.9. I've actually marked this down a little. And I used to love this episode. I really used to love it. And I do, on the whole, like a well put together time travel episode. But on rewatching this, I found that I didn't enjoy this one as much as I used to in my younger days. And the science takes me out of it a little bit. The incorrect interpretation of how time travel would work, if it could work, because there's no way it will work like that. Absolutely no way at all. So it's just ridiculous how that was portrayed. So a 7 it is for me, and I think that is about right. And with that, let's wind things out and have a little bit of a debrief. So there you go. A decent episode, not an outstanding episode, one that I thoroughly enjoyed when I watched it in younger years, but it has definitely got some flaws that I didn't used to see when I just watched these things for fun and I didn't dissect them to pieces. But that's what we're here for. We love a bit of dissecting and nitpicking as Star Trek fans, don't we? Anyway, let me know what you thought of this episode. Is it one of your favorites? Is it not? Have I missed anything that you would have highlighted? Have I been too kind to it, too harsh? Do let me know. Please give me a thumbs up as well and hit the notifications bell so you don't miss an episode. I'll be back soon with another episode. Not one I'm looking forward to. Return of the Archons. I actually think this one might even be worse than the alternative factor, so I'll do my best to go through it diligently, but truth be told, I don't even want to review it at all. I want to just get it over with. But anyway, I'll try and do it some justice. Thank you for watching. Do take care, stay safe, travel well, and live well and prosper. Bye-bye.